Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The world had long since fallen into ruin. What was once a proud and united kingdom now lay shattered, divided between greedy warlords and broken promises. Villages burned as soldiers marched through the countryside, enforcing the will of whatever petty ruler controlled that particular stretch of land. There was no peace, only a constant shifting of power between those strong enough to hold it and the desperate masses crushed beneath their boots. Carol had grown tired of it all. As the sun set behind the distant hills, casting a red glow across the sky, he stood at the edge of a village, watching the smoke rise in the distance. He adjusted the sword slung across his back, a weight he had carried for too long. His boots were worn from years of travel, his clothes dusty from the road. His face, hidden beneath the hood of his cloak, showed the weariness of a man who had seen too much. He had been a knight once, sworn to serve the kingdom in its time of glory. But that kingdom was gone now, replaced by endless conflict, and Kyle had left that life behind. He traveled now, not for duty, but for survival, avoiding the conflicts and keeping his head low. The villagers who passed him gave only brief nods, sensing the presence of a man who wanted no trouble. They had seen enough men with swords in these troubled times. Carol made his way toward the edge of the village, where a small inn still stood, its sign creaking in the wind. The place was quiet, too quiet. He pushed open the door, and the few patrons inside glanced up, eyes wary but quickly turning away. He approached the counter, motioning for the innkeeper, a stout woman with lines of worry etched deep into her face. "A room?" she asked without much interest. "For the night," Carol replied, his voice low and rough. He handed over a few coins, barely enough to cover the cost, but the innkeeper took them without complaint. Before he could retreat to the shadows of his rented room, the door to the inn burst open, and the peace was shattered. A group of bandits stormed inside, their faces twisted with malice and greed. They had the look of men who had long since abandoned any semblance of honor. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a jagged scar running down his cheek, pointed toward the back of the inn, where a small caravan of travelers had huddled, trying to avoid notice. "Out of our way," the scarred man barked, his voice rough as gravel. "Hand over your goods, or we'll burn this place to the ground." Carol's hand instinctively moved toward his sword, but he stopped himself. This wasn't Treda's fight. He had given up the days of heroics long ago. The villagers had nothing worth stealing, but the bandits were more interested in the caravan, a group of merchants, likely traveling under the misguided hope that the roads would be safe. Among them was a young boy, no older than 15, his eyes wide with fear as he clutched a small satchel. He stood next to an older man dressed in the worn armor of a knight, his hand gripping a sword, though the years had slowed him and his movements lacked the confidence of youth. The innkeeper's siren trembled as she backed away, and the room grew still, everyone waiting for the inevitable. The bandit leader sneered, his hand going for the dagger at his belt. "Last chance," he growled. The old knight stepped forward, his voice steady despite the danger. "We are no threat to you. Let us pass in peace, and we will not trouble you." The bandits laughed, their harsh cackles filling the air. Carl closed his eyes for a moment, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. He didn't want to get involved. He had seen too much blood spilled over the years, had been a part of too many battles where good men died for causes that no longer mattered. But something about the boy's wide-eyed fear, the old knight's shaky resolve, tugged at him. With a resigned sigh, Carol stood. His movements were slow, deliberate, as he stepped away from the shadows and into the center of the room. The bandits stopped laughing, turning their attention to the lone man who had dared stand against them. The scarred leader, lip-curled in amusement. "And who are you supposed to be?" He yelled an answer. Instead, he drew his sword in one smooth motion, the blade gleaming in the dim light of the inn. The bandit leader, his eyes narrowed, but he did tee back down. "Big mistake, friend," the leader sneered, pulling his dagger free. The fight that followed was swift. Carol's blade danced through the air with deadly precision, each strike landing with a force that spoke of years of experience. The bandits were no match for him. Their overconfidence and brutish strength were useless against Carol's skill. In mere moments, the floor was littered with bodies, and the survivors fled into the night, their leader clutching a wound on his arm as he stumbled away. Silence filled the inn once more. The villagers stared in awe, the merchants in shock, and the old knight lowered his sword, looking at Carol with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "Thank you," the knight said, stepping forward. "You saved us." Kyle sheathed his sword, already turning away to Tito it for thanks. He muttered, moving toward the door. Wait, the boy called out, his voice trembling but filled with an earnestness that gave Carell pause. We need your help. Carol stopped, but didn't he turn around? I am not interested. We not just merchants, the old knight said quietly. This boy is Prince Alec, the rightful heir to the throne. Carol's hand tightened on the door handle, but he still did look back. There is no throne anymore. But there can be, Alec insisted, stepping forward. If you help us, we can restore the kingdom. We can end this war, bring peace back to the land. Hal turned then, his eyes hard as they met the boy's at peace. You think there's still hope for that? Alaric's eyes didn't waver. I do, and I think you do too. For a moment, Carl considered the boy Chair's words. There had been a time when he would have fought for such a cause, when the idea of restoring peace would have stirred something within him. But that time had passed. The kingdom was broken, and no amount of idealism from a young prince could fix that. I am sorry, Kale said, finally, his voice heavy with regret, but I am done fighting for lost causes. Without another word, he pushed open the door and stepped into the cold night, leaving the inn and the boy behind. Carol moved quickly, his boots crunching on the gravel road as the cold night air bit at his face. He didn't look back. He never looked back. That was how he survived all these years. Yet no matter how far he walked, the boy Seth's words echoed in his mind. I think you do too. It had been years since anyone believed in something so deeply. Years since Carol had believed in anything at all. The land was a carcass picked clean by warlords and mercenaries, and idealism died with the first blood spill. That was the world he lived in now, not one of kings and heirs, not one of noble causes. The road stretched on, the darkness swallowing him as he moved farther from the village. He kept his pace steady, his mind focused on the familiar rhythm of survival, one step in front of the other, never slowing, never stopping. But even as he pressed forward, a thought nagged at him. The boy had the look of someone who'd seen more than he should have at his age, yet he hadn't broken. Something about that stirred a long-buried feeling in Carl's chest. He hadn't gone far when he heard it, hoofbeats, faint at first, then growing louder. He slowed his steps, hand instinctively moving toward his sword, eyes narrowing as the sound drew nearer. Whoever it was, they weren't traveling casually. The urgency in the pounding hooves made that clear. Mael turned just as a rider came into view, pushing their horse hard. It was the old knight Sir Darian, his face pale, blood dripping from a gash along his arm. He pulled the horse to a stop, breath coming in, ragged gasp. Kyle Darian called out, his voice strained. They've found a... Kyle's jaw tightened. Who? Sarikat's men, they came in the night. The prince, he's still back at the inn. You have to help him. Kyle cursed under his breath. He knew the consequences of getting involved. This was exactly what he had tried to avoid. But something in Darian's eyes, the sheer desperation, made Carol pause. He had seen enough death to know when a fight was over, but this night he wasn't ready to give up. And the boy Carol had to admit, there was something about Alaric that reminded him of a time when he too had fought for more than just survival. Where are they? Colonel asked, his voice low. They were surrounding the village. We held them off, but we won. Tal last long. Kale didn't need to hear more. He nodded sharply, turning on his heel and sprinting back toward the village. His mind raced as he calculated the distance, his hand gripping the hilt of his sword tightly. He knew the layout of the land well enough, having passed through these roads countless times. The village wasn't far, but with soldiers already there, it would be a bloody fight. He reached the edge of the village just as the first signs of combat erupted. Torches lit up the night sky, casting flickering shadows over the thatched roof. Screams echoed in the darkness, accompanied by the clash of steel. Carol moved through the shadows, avoiding detection as he made his way toward the inn. His eyes scanned the scene quickly. Dukes or Excel men were everywhere, ruthless and efficient, cutting down anyone who stood in their way. Kyle spotted Alec near the NS entrance, clutching a short sword that looked far too heavy for his slight frame. The boy's face was pale, but his eyes were fierce with determination as he tried to defend himself against one of the soldiers. Without hesitation, Carol charged forward. His sword flashed in the torchlight, and the soldier fell before he even had time to register Carol's arrival. Alaric looked up, startled, but recognition quickly replaced the fear in his eye. You came back, the boy said, breathless. Kael didn't respond. Instead, he grabbed the boy by the arm, pulling him behind the cover of a nearby building. "Stay low," he ordered, scanning the area for more soldiers. "We are getting out of here." Alec nodded, his voice small. "Darian?" Kael shook his head. "His son coming, just focus on surviving right now." They moved quickly, ducking between buildings, avoiding the main streets where the bulk of Sarek forces were concentrated. Kael led the way, his sword ready for any threats, while Alec followed close behind, his breath coming in, sharp, frightened gasp. They could hear the chaos around them, but Carol knew they wouldn't be able to outrun the soldiers for long. They needed a plan. As they rounded the corner of a burned-out house, Carel spotted Sir Darian. The old knight was fending off two soldiers, his sword movement slower and more labored than before. Blood poured from his wounds, but he fought with the desperation of a man who knew this might be his last stand. Cariel moved swiftly, joining the fray. His sword cut through the air, and the soldiers fell before they even had a chance to react. Darian staggered, barely able to stay on his feet, but he gave Kunla a grateful nod. "We have to get to the capital." Darian wheezed, "It's our only chance." Hero frowned. "The capital, you'll never make it with the prince, not with Surak's men on your tail." Darian shook his head. "We don't have a choice. Auric needs to be crowned before Sarek consolidates power. There are still those in the capital who would support him, but we need time." Carol glanced at the boy who was watching them both with wide eyes. It was clear that he believed in this plan, no matter how slim the chances. Cariel sighed. He had already come this far. Turning back now would mean certain death for the boy, and perhaps something worse for the kingdom. "Fine," Cariel said, "but we'll need a distraction." He turned to Alec. "Listen to me. Stay with Darian. Get to the horses and ride north. I'll hold off Sarek's men here." Alec's eyes widened, but no arguments. Carol said firmly, "You want to restore this kingdom. You want to end the war. Then do as I say." Alaric swallowed hard but nodded, his grip tightening on his sword. Kiel gave him a brief nod before turning and heading back toward the heart of the village. The fight ahead would be brutal, but Corral had never feared battle. He had lived his entire life with the sword, and tonight would be no different. He could hear the soldiers closing in, the sound of their armor clanking as they moved through the street. Kettle stood in the center of the square, his sword raised, ready to meet them. One by one, Sarek men emerged from the shadows, their faces twisted with cruel grins as they recognized their quarry. But Tiel didn't yet flinch. He had chosen this path, and he would see it through to the end. The first soldier charged, his spear thrusting toward Carol's chest. Carol sidestepped the attack, bringing his sword down in a swift arc, cutting the man down. Another came at him from behind, but Carel spun, his blade flashing as it found its mark. The fight was fast and furious, but Carol moved with the grace and precision of a man who had fought 1,000 battles. The square was soon littered with bodies, but Carmel knew more would come. He could feel his muscles burning, the weight of his sword heavier with each swing, but he couldn't stop, not yet, not until Alaric was safe. He fought on, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his vision blurring at the edges. But he didn't falter. Each step, each strike was calculated, and soon the remaining soldiers hesitated, fear creeping into their eyes as they realized they were up against something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. Caridad didn't time to regroup. He pressed forward, his sword a blur of motion, cutting down anyone who dared stand in his way. The soldiers began to retreat, their confidence shattered, but Carol pursued them relentlessly, driving them from the village. Only when the last of them had fled did Carol finally lower his sword. His arms ached, his body screamed in protest, but he didn't let it show. He had done what was necessary, and now it was time to see if Alaric and Darian had made it out alive. He turned, making his way back toward the edge of the village where the horses had been tethered. As he approached, he saw them, Alaric and Darian, mounted and ready to ride, their eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. Kale gave them a nod, his voice rough as he spoke. "Go, I'll catch up." Alaric hesitated for a moment, his eyes locking with Carol. "Thank you." Kiel didn't respond. Instead, he watched as they rode off into the night, their figures quickly swallowed by the darkness. For the first time in years, Carol felt something stir within him. Maybe, just maybe, there was still hope for this broken kingdom after all.